I'm Will Haynes of the Watkins Museum of History, and tonight I'm delighted to speak with a fellow alum of the University of Kansas, Dr. Kristen Epps. So hello again, Kristen.
Hi, thank you for having me tonight.
Totally our pleasure. Kristen teaches American history at Kansas State University and also serves as the managing editor of Kansas History, a journal of the Central Plains. She authored Slavery on the Periphery, the Kansas-Missouri border in the antebellum and Civil War eras. Today, we'll speak with Kristen about her book and the surprising truths of slavery in early Kansas and along the Kansas-Missouri border. We encourage you, the audience members, to get involved by posting questions for our guest in the comments. So, Kristen, I'd like to start off by asking if you could set the scene for us. What was the history of the Kansas-Missouri border region like prior to 1820? And how did white Americans and their customs, including slavery, first come to this area?
Great question for starting out. So the history of this region is pretty complicated. Of course, the first inhabitants were indigenous nations, including the Osage, the Kansa. For instance, I am currently on land that belonged to the Kansa or the Ka Nation. But starting really in the 1700s, European nations, particularly the French and the Spanish, began to come into this region and claim it for themselves. And they did this using something called the doctrine of discovery, which essentially gave, according to Europeans, gave them the right to occupy this land. And of course, this leads to conflict with indigenous nations. And so the Americans don't really get here, of course, until after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, and we start to see the American presence really pick up in the region. And really quite early on, enslaved people are coming out to what is now the Kansas-Missouri border. So for instance, Fort Osage, which is in Jackson County on kind of the outskirts of modern Kansas City, Missouri, the factor of the fort, George Sibley, actually owned enslaved people. And so you start to see, beginning especially around the time that Missouri becomes a territory in 1812, you start to see white missionaries, white military officers, white traders, particularly like the Choteau family that's well known if you know anything about St. Louis history. They start to come out, and many of them, not all of them, bring enslaved people with them. So you see African slaves coming out to the region all the way back in the 1820s. So it has kind of a complicated history. There's a lot of movement in and out of the region, and a lot of conflict over resources. For instance, again, the indigenous people who are already present in the region don't appreciate the Europeans and the Americans coming in. But it's a really kind of fluid and interesting story. And then, of course, Missouri becomes a state in 1821. And so white immigration and the immigration of slaveholders really picks up after 1821.
Right. Well, that's very good. Thank you for setting the scene for us. So many of our viewers are likely familiar with the story of how the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 set the region up as a battleground over the issues of slavery and its expansion into the West. But I wonder, does the popular memory of the border during the so-called Bleeding Kansas era suffer from any popular misconceptions?
Oh, yes, great question.
Yeah.
So yes, many of the viewers might be familiar with the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which was hotly debated in Congress. And it's what created Kansas Territory and Nebraska Territory. And by the way, just for those of you that don't know, Kansas Territory at that time actually existed or extended all the way to the Rocky Mountains, to the Front Range of Colorado. So upon the creation of Kansas and Nebraska, we'll focus more today on Kansas, of course, you see this conversation in Congress, in Washington, D.C., but also around the nation about whether or not slavery should expand into the region. And it's not the first time there's been conversation about Western expansion and the role that slavery would play in that. But it's very hotly contested. And so kind of the traditional story, right, is that white Northerners come to Kansas and they're all abolitionists and they all are fighting to stop slavery spread. And then on the flip side, you have all of these white Southerners, particularly Missourians, who are pro-slavery, and they're all coming, every one of them, to spread slavery. And the story, of course, is much more nuanced. So there are plenty of people coming out here just because it's land that is now being made available to them. But for those that do come for partisan reasons, it's not as clear-cut of a story, I think, as folks might assume. One of the things that I try to do in the book, as far as misconceptions go, is to challenge this idea of it being a white-centric story, a story where the opinions and thoughts and beliefs of white folks are centered in the story, and to really try to talk about how slavery functioned on the border and how enslaved people and free people of color shaped the border. So for me, a big misconception is this idea that there weren't enslaved people here on the border, that this was all this sort of abstract debate about whether or not slavery should expand into the West and what that might mean for the United States. And it's this very kind of cerebral, again, abstract, not rooted in reality kind of debate. But when you look at the evidence, what you see is that there were, as I mentioned, a minute ago, there were already enslaved people living in the region. So slavery had been here since the 1820s, at least. And so by the 1850s, slavery had a history here. The population of Missouri had been growing since statehood in 1821. Enslaved people make up a percentage of that population. So one of the important points to note is that this is an actual concrete reality. Slavery existed in this region. And when we think about it that way, that this isn't this abstract debate about slavery's expansion, but that in fact it involves real human beings, and that's a system that already existed in the region, I think that changes the way that we frame the questions that we ask and the way that we approach the sources, because white Missourians know slavery existed already on the border. And so they're not framing it necessarily as bringing slavery to Kansas. Many of them are aware that slavery already exists, and granted a very small number in a very nascent form in Kansas already. So we have to, again, kind of reframe the way that we think about it and realize that it not only involves actual human beings, right? The enslaved people who are coming are human beings, but also that it is so much more complex than kind of the traditional narrative.
Yeah. And I really appreciate your point about how we should remember that we're talking about real, actual human beings whose lives are at stake here in this whole debate, which sometimes got abstract about, whether slavery would be allowed and popular sovereignty. And you're right, often, and I've been guilty of this when I give tours, we talk about slavery as a possibility on the frontier and in the Kansas territory, and how the settlers, many of them were supposedly here to deny that from becoming a reality. But as you've just pointed out, it was a reality, albeit in relatively small numbers of people. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And I like your point about, wanting to foreground the experiences of these enslaved persons too, and not just make it a white centric story as it's been for so many decades.
And that's really difficult to do because the sources that exist, right, are the vast majority of them come from the white perspective. So I certainly can't claim that I've done a perfect job of this, but one of the goals that I had was to try to find those voices and try to make sure that I can magnify those voices and those stories as much as possible.
Excellent. So in this work, mobility is a major theme, and you talk about mobility being a factor in, life on the border, including the lives of the enslaved persons. But how was slavery in Western Missouri and Eastern Kansas different from elsewhere in America? And how is it similar? So what was life like for the enslaved and for the people who are living around them? And also, how was mobility? How did that play a role?
Well, mobility is a factor from the very beginning, because how are these people getting here? Whether they're white or they're people of color, right? They are coming here from elsewhere. So we have what Ira Berlin, he's a well-known historian of slavery. what Ira Berlin calls the second Middle Passage. So the term Middle Passage refers to the journey from Africa to the Americas that enslaved captives experienced. And so he terms the second Middle Passage this movement from the Eastern Seaboard and from, deep South states, or even states like Virginia, this movement into places that were for them the West, Missouri, Arkansas, places like that. And so this second Middle Passage is bringing millions of people out into the border regions. So you have an example of mobility right there. Now, the form of slavery that existed on the Kansas-Missouri border is what we call a small scale system. So this is not the plantation model that you see depicted in pop culture, or, if you've seen Gone with the Wind or 12 Years a Slave, or, these sorts of kind of popular depictions. That's one model for how slavery looked, particularly in the Deep South, where you have large cotton plantations. But what we see in the Upper South, which would include Missouri, Kentucky, places like that, but also, of course, where we're focusing on the Kansas-Missouri border, is this small-scale system. So a small-scale system is fewer individuals living within the household. Their forms of labor might differ. So, for instance, in the 1850 census, in the counties that I study along the Missouri border, so not talking about, St. Louis, about 16% or so of the population was enslaved. This is very different than in the Deep South, where you might have, in those counties, 50, 60, 70, 80% of the population even being enslaved. So it's a smaller scale system. So there's fewer enslaved people in the household or on the farm. That means there's closer contact between the slave owner and the enslaved people that they are enslaving. You also see in small scale systems the need for things like, and my colleague Diane Moody Burke, who teaches at UMKC, talks about this a lot in her book. If you are living on a small farm, where can you go to find a romantic partner or a future spouse? You have to look outside of your immediate household. And so you have what are called abroad marriages. So people who are on different farms or in different households that end up marrying. Now, enslaved people could not marry legally, but they can have a religious ceremony and some sort of commitment ceremony. So in a small scale system, you see a lot of abroad marriages, which ties in with your point about mobility, because then there's, you're traveling, a few miles down the road to see your spouse and your children potentially. And you're having visitors come to see you. And so there's a lot of more movement, I think, among enslaved people and also free people of color than one might expect. So that's one element of small scale slaveholding. And there are some others, that we could talk about at some point as well. But again, the mobility aspect of it's really important, because when you're building a community on the border, which is what we're seeing happen in this early period, there's a lot of labor that goes into that. And so enslaved people might be working in a field, which again is kind of the stereotype that we have of enslaved labor, is that it's plantation, cotton fields and cotton production. But you also see enslaved people working in businesses, for instance, in some of the shops in Independence, Missouri, where they're outfitting, wagon trains for the Santa Fe Trail. You have enslaved people working as carpenters and wheelwrights. So there's these other kinds of industries and other kinds of skilled professions where enslaved people are doing labor. So that's, again, also linked to this idea of mobility, right? You're helping to outfit these wagon trains going on the Santa Fe Trail. And there's lots of anecdotes, that we have of individuals who are crossing the border and going back and forth. And so, one example that connects to Lawrence is the story of Jim Daniels. So since this is part of this Encountering John Brown series, I think I kind of have to talk about John Brown. You might be familiar with his raid into Missouri. I'm sure many of the viewers have heard of this, where he takes a group of his men and he goes into Missouri and he liberates 11 enslaved people who are in just across the border in southern Missouri. And, he brings them out of slavery. In the process, one of the slave owners is killed, and he brings them out of slavery. They end up staying in Lawrence at the Grover Barn, which, if you haven't been to Lawrence recently, some of the viewers might be interested to know that they have interpretive panels up now at the Grover Barn. They're really neat to talk about this. And so what's interesting about that story is not just that it's an escape story, right? A story of the Underground Railroad, but the fact that the reason why John Brown knew about Jim Daniels in the first place was because Jim Daniels had come across the border and spoken to John Brown and said, me and my wife are about to be sold away, and we really need your help. And he was able to do this because he came over under the pretext of selling brooms. And so he's framed this as like this business trip, right? But he's actually coming over to solicit aid from, this, advocate for Black equality, who he knows is probably going to help him out, because Brown tended to do that sort of thing. So this mobility aspect, right, comes in because he's able to make contact with Brown. Brown is then able to listen to his story, empathize with his story, and then we see these 11 people who are brought out of slavery, and one of them actually gives birth on the trip. So it's actually 12 people who are rescued from slavery. So that's, again, kind of one of these examples of the role that mobility plays in all of this. That's, I think, really important. So I guess the second part of your question had to do with how is it the same?
Right.
So that's also a big part of the story, right? It is a different context, right? It's a Western context. It's not the same context as the Deep South. But slavery, wherever you're talking about a system of chattel slavery, which is where enslaved people are treated legally and socially as property, in any chattel slavery system, the entirety of the system is predicated on the use of violence or the threat of violence in some way. So old timers in Kansas who talked about their experiences during Bleeding Kansas would sometimes say, yeah, slavery, we knew about slavery, but it wasn't a big part of our society, and slave owners treated their slaves well. And this is kind of the story that folks sometimes promote when they talk about it. But we see examples of violence all over the place on the Missouri side and on the Kansas side of the line. And again, it's because if you are enslaving someone, there is force and violence and threats of violence and threats of sale and all of these different things that have to be a part of it. So I actually thought I might read from the book just really quickly. This is the beginning of chapter 3, and I tell a story about Atchison here. And I thought I would read it just because I think reading it maybe is better than me trying to tell it again. So this is an example of the violence inherent in the system and how that impacted the experiences of enslaved people. So in July 1855, a 39-year-old enslaved woman named Lucinda reached her breaking point. Suffering abuse at the hands of her owner, Grafton Thomason, she escaped and found peace in the hereafter when she drowned in the Missouri River near Atchison. After her body washed ashore by the ferry landing, it lay undisturbed for nearly 3 days, a silent, ominous testament to slavery's abuses, and a warning to both abolitionists and other slaves who might be inclined to resist white authority. The local community of Atchison, a notoriously strong center of pro-slavery sentiment, buzzed with gossip. Had she taken her own life? Was she mad? What had happened within Thomason's household to inspire such a final act of desperation? Perhaps she had been sexually assaulted. As the only enslaved woman in the Thomason household, she would have been vulnerable to such treatment. Or maybe she resisted her owner's will, carving out a limited sense of personal autonomy through resistance that proved unfruitful. An abolitionist lawyer, originally from Cincinnati, J.W.B. Kelly, publicly denounced the treatment of her body and hypothesized that Thomason's cruelty and alcoholism had led to her demise. In retaliation, Thomason and other pro-slavery locals stripped off Kelly's clothes and whipped him. Kelly was then banished from the territory, never to be heard from again. Lucinda's apparent suicide and Kelly's abuse at the hands of a vigilante mob acts out in stark relief the fact that slavery existed in Kansas in 1855. So there's so many elements to her story. And again, we don't have any evidence from her or enslaved people who witnessed this, what what was going on. So we do have to have, some qualifies in there because there's some conjecture that's part of it. But I think that it's an example of just the pervasiveness of violence in the system that she apparently chose to end her life rather than to remain enslaved.
Yeah.
So I know that was kind of a long answer, but slavery in any system is going to be predicated on the use of violence. So the fact that it's a little bit, it takes a little bit of a different form here in small scale slavery doesn't mean that there isn't an element of coercion and violence that's part of it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's very true. And I appreciate you reading that excerpt. So I have a question that just occurred to me. We have some audience questions as well. You mentioned, there was a high rate of mobility with, abroad marriages and other instances in which the enslaved persons were moving back and forth. I was always curious, it was always my understanding that they were tightly controlled. And I'm wondering, was there a difficulty in moving around, and was there some kind of identification system so that if a white person, on a slave patrol or something did come across someone, they weren't necessarily in a lot of trouble, they could identify themselves?
So this is a similarity with slavery elsewhere in the sense
Yeah.
that there are local ordinances that kind of dictate things like curfews or a pass system where you have to have a pass. But one of the things I always do when I talk about slavery with my students and the ways that the law is part of this system is that, like every law, it's up to how well it's enforced, right? That's really what dictates its efficacy. So there might be local ordinances that say enslaved people have to be in their homes by 10 p.m. or these sorts of things. And they would have been done mostly on the local level, or even not a law, but just sort of a societal expectation, right? That certain things happen. But that doesn't mean that everyone's following it or paying attention to it. So it's very possible that an enslaved person might go to see their spouse in the middle of the night and be stopped and not have a pass, but the person who stops them knows, oh, he's going to see his wife, Susan. And so go ahead, have a good time. Just make sure you're back home by dawn. So those sorts of things absolutely happen. And it's very much dependent on, again, that local community context and how well you know your neighbors, how well your neighbors know you. Neighbors back then are all in your business, just like neighbors today can be all in your business. So it's very much the situation is very much dependent on kind of that local context.
You did mention this second middle passage. I wonder, or one of our guests wondered, was it the farmers, the owners of the enslaved persons that were transporting people west, or did slave traders bring a lot of these folks to the area?
It's both.
Okay.
So households that are coming out to settle the region where enslaved people are part of that household, they're traveling alongside their owner and the owner's family. That absolutely happens. But there is also a thriving slave trade in the region as well. So one of the major centers for that is St. Louis. And so there's a lot of movement, particularly between St. Louis and the Kansas City area. And there are multiple stories of enslaved people being sold in Kansas or in the border region more generally, maybe someplace like Westport or Independence or, St. Joseph or someplace like that. And so there absolutely are examples of enslaved people being on the auction block. We don't, again, have evidence from the enslaved perspective about that, right? It comes from, newspaper articles and advertisements and stuff of that, that nature. But yeah, those are both important ways that we have to think about mobility, because it's not, we can think about mobility in positive ways and we can think about it in negative ways. So those are examples of enslaved people being told what they have to do, right? They do not have agency in that decision. But there are also examples of mobility that are, again, positive, right? Like the story of Jim Daniels that I mentioned before, where he's taking agency over his own mobility in order to seek escape, right? So one of the things I talk about in the book is how there's this push and pull, this sort of tug of war between enslaved people and slave owners
Mm.
over who controls their mobility. So enslaved people want to try to control their own mobility as much as possible, right? They want to have the agency to visit their loved ones, to visit their spouse,
Right.
to whatever. But of course, slave owners are looking to control enslaved people's mobility, to limit their mobility, right? To make their mobility serve the slave owners' ends, right? Like forcing them to come out from Kentucky or wherever they're from. So there's this kind of constant battle that takes place in the region over who gets to control that mobility, and enslaved people very much resist and very much reject as much as they can slave owners or slave traders control over their bodies.
That's very interesting. Before we get back to the questions that I prepared, we had another good question from one of our partners here in Lawrence, Holly Zane of the Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. And she wonders, she mentioned the abolitionist Wyandot people in Quindaro, but were there other Native American groups that were involved in the Underground Railroad on the border?
Well, that's a good question. So the story of the Indigenous nations who are here is very complex, because you have the Indigenous nations who are already present before whites arrived. The Kansa and the Osage are a couple of examples of that. And then you have all of these immigrant nations. These are people that are brought out forcibly during the process of removal. So that would include the Wyandot. It would include the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Potawatomi, the Sac and Fox. Many different nations are part of that. And some of them are pro-slavery, some of them are anti-slavery. Some nations are split, where some of their tribal members are opposed to slavery and some are supportive of slavery, and some own enslaved people themselves. So there are, sort of limited examples of Indigenous people assisting with the escape of enslaved people. If I recall correctly, Thomas Johnson at one point complains about this, or someone associated with the Shawnee Mission complains about enslaved people getting help from the local Indigenous nations around Shawnee Mission. So it absolutely happens. And again, just like with white folks who are coming here from back east, it just very much varies on your experience with slavery, your background. All those factors shape how you view the system. So there are, more than one tribal nation that does actually, there are members that own enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's complicated, which is part of why I think it's fun to study this period. Not that every history doesn't have its own complications, but because there are all of these layers, because you have this story of Indigenous removal and dispossession, you have the story of enslavement, you have all of Manifest Destiny, all these different narratives that are all kind of wrapped up together.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, Kristen, how did slavery as a social and an economic institution change the border region?
Well, when slavery becomes more entrenched as we get into the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, and again, it's never a large scale system, right? It still remains a small scale system, but as slavery becomes more entrenched, the main point I always want to emphasize is that when we think about the building of frontier communities, we want to recognize the people who are doing a lot of that building, which is the enslaved people. These are the people who, when you're starting your town, they don't have the authority to create the town association or sell lots or any of these sorts of town development things. But they're the people that are, building the homes, building the barns and outbuildings, getting rid of all of the brush to clear a road. Sometimes running ferries across, the river or the stream. And so a lot of these kind of infrastructure things that we think about as far as building communities is really work, not all of it, but much of it is done by enslaved people. And so when we think about the border region and how it changes, would the border region have looked the same if enslaved labor hadn't helped build it? I guess is kind of a way to sort of turn that question back around. So As far as the political side goes, I think the presence of enslaved people in Missouri in particular in these border counties like Jackson County and Clay County and Platte County and Buchanan County, which is where St. Joseph is. I think the violence of Bleeding Kansas and the passion that many people felt about Bleeding Kansas would not have been the same if there weren't already enslaved people on the Missouri side, because one of the main concerns that white Missourians have is that if Kansas becomes a free state, right, all of their enslaved people in Missouri are going to race to Kansas. They already have Iowa up north that's a free state. They already have Illinois. So that, I think, is an important factor to remember, that so much of the anxiety that white Missourians on the border have is very much tied to the fact that they do own enslaved property. And so this is the stakes for them are very high when it comes to the future of Kansas, even higher than someone in some other slave state, right? Like Kentucky or Tennessee. For Missourians who are slaveholders or aspire to be slaveholders, who are pro-slavery, the future of Kansas is absolutely central to their own economic and political goals.
Interesting. Well, we had another audience question, and but I'd actually like to expand upon it. So this viewer was particularly interested in knowing if you used any property tax records in Kansas and Missouri, but I'm wondering about your larger sources that you used. How did you mentioned how difficult it was to recover the voices of the enslaved, but what kind of sources did you find in constructing this story for your book, Slavery on the Periphery?
So I first got the idea for this project, oh gosh, many years ago, almost 20 years ago. And I first came across stories of enslaved people in reminiscences, where people were talking about life during Bleeding Kansas. And so that was sort of the first source I encountered. And then, of course, if you look at the 1855 territorial Kansas census, you see that there were enslaved people enumerated on that. And so that's another source. Of course, there are more sources for Missouri because the enslaved population was much bigger. So the enslaved population in Kansas was probably around 200 to 400 people. So it's much smaller. There were tens of thousands of enslaved people in just the Missouri border counties. So, numerically, there's going to be more evidence from the Missouri side, just, logically.
Yeah.
So those were the kind of original sources that I looked at. But of course, there are very few of those, right? And it's a very brief mention. It will often just be, someone casually mentioning, oh, and the enslaved person in that home, did all of the cooking. And it'll be one little sentence, which is helpful, but not, particularly, illustrative of kind of the context and that sort of thing. So what I discovered as I was doing research, because this started out as my dissertation, and then of course I adapted it into book form, was how important public records would be, because there were so few private records, diaries and that sort of thing that I could rely on. So I really had to do a lot of digging in public records. So this would include tax records. This would include probate records. So wills and inventories that are taken of someone's estate after they pass. I use those. There aren't a lot of those for Kansas. There's more for Missouri. So those are important. Also, legal documents that are not probate related are also important. So criminal cases that involve enslaved people are helpful. So my strategy was, because I knew so little was available, I just would look for anything and everything. Try anything, try everything, try to kind of think outside the box and be creative. And I'm sure still many things I missed, and there's stories that I've come across just in the last couple of years that I wish I had known about when the book came out. But any kind of evidence that I had, I tried to make the most of, and to really dig in and to pull out any sort of threads that I could that would give me insight into how slavery operated, and most importantly, the experience of the enslaved people. So that was
Yeah.
kind of a long answer, but yes, I did use tax records.
Yeah. And I imagine that you went to a variety of locations to find these records, like courthouses and county historical societies and libraries, that sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the kind of project that could have taken 20 years to write, and I just didn't have
Right.
timeline.
Yeah.
So there are places that I didn't go that I would love to go to. But yeah, I mean, I did research in Lawrence, obviously, research at the Kansas Historical Society in Topeka, research at various repositories in St. Louis and Columbia, Missouri. The National Archives has a branch in Kansas City. And then some smaller places too. The Jackson County, Missouri Historical Society was very helpful.
Hmm.
And so there are, I'm sure, sources in some courthouse, that I have not had access to, that someone should absolutely mine and explore, because I'm sure there are so many stories out there still.
Yeah. That's what I love about research. I mean, even with a subject that can be quite sad like this one, it is like being a detective, right? You just ferret out whatever you can from all these disparate places and try to determine what happened and construct a narrative. It can be, it's a lot of work, but it's a lot of fun too. And,
Yes.
so to get back to the history, the actual events, so how did chattel slavery, so the whole concept of ownership of another human being, uh, codified in law, how did that finally end in Kansas and Missouri, especially in Kansas, which, as you pointed out, is our main interest tonight?
So the population of enslaved people in Kansas, we think, was, at its height, maybe around 400 people. We don't have really
Yeah.
great records on this because people are moving in and out of the territory so much, and there's a lot of conflict. So according to the 1860 census, so of course we have a federal census every 10 years. So
Mhm.
according to the 1860 census, there were 2 enslaved people in Kansas in 1860, which again may or may not actually be accurate. Probably it was a little bit higher than that. But of course, viewers might be familiar with the many different constitutional conflicts in Kansas about how Kansas would enter the Union. And so when Kansas does finally enter the Union in January of 1861, it enters as a free state. There are already Southern states that have seceded by the end of January 29th, 1861. And so slavery, legally is outlawed at that point. But on the Missouri side, slavery is legal through the Civil War. So it's not until 1865 that slavery is outlawed in Missouri. The Emancipation Proclamation does not apply to Missouri. So what we see is, and this was true before the war, what we see is enslaved people in Missouri fleeing into Kansas. They fled before the war. They flee in even higher numbers as the war begins. And so you have a growing free Black population in Kansas, and the population in these Missouri border counties of people who are enslaved is decreasing as the war progresses, as more and more escape. So the story in Missouri, again, we won't talk quite as much about, but the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't apply. And so enslaved people are coming to Iowa, Illinois, Kansas to seek freedom. And the important thing I always want to remind listeners of and students of when I talk about this subject is that freedom does not come with the stroke of a pen or the stroke of the president's pen. If you think about the Emancipation Proclamation, it really comes through the actions of the enslaved people themselves. So they don't have the authority to legally free themselves, right? So there's multiple, I describe it as there's multiple players in this process, right, that have to be part of this process. But the people who are most motivated, most concerned with the plight of enslaved people are enslaved people themselves and people who are formerly enslaved or are people of color and empathize with people who've been enslaved. So they're the ones that are running away. They're the ones that are pressuring Union commanders to accept them. They are the ones that are saying, we want to, if they're men, fight for the U.S. Army during the war. They're the ones that are pressuring Abraham Lincoln to advocate for emancipation. And of course, he comes around to that idea. So that's really, I think, central to understanding how slavery ends, is that it's not only white people driving this. Although, of course, there are white people who are, adamant about seeing the slave system end, but it's really the actions of the enslaved people. So slavery really isn't in Kansas right after statehood, but you have this growing population of Black refugees who have come from not just Missouri, but Arkansas, Texas, places like that, who are needing help, needing assistance, needing employment, needing to get settled in Kansas. And so there's a lot that white Kansans can do during the war to help these people. And so abolitionists who before the war and during Bleeding Kansas, right, were advocating for the end of slavery, are now given this opportunity to actually do something physically to end the system by helping these Black refugees. And then, of course, in Missouri, it's a little bit different, the way that things play out. But yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Kristen, I really want to thank you for this illuminating discussion tonight. It's been fantastic. I just have one final question, and you feel free to get as self-indulgent on this one as you would like. I believe you have a book under contract right now with the University Press of Kansas titled American Crossroads. I'm really curious, what is that book about, and when can we expect to find it available?
Okay, so this is a book that I am co-authoring with a colleague of mine at Johnson County Community College, Jim Liker, who some of y'all might have heard of. Published a number of things on Kansas history. So essentially, I teach Kansas history now that I'm at K-State. I was previously teaching in various other states. And there isn't really a great central narrative of Kansas history that exists. There are a few that there's many books on Kansas that are excellent, but we need really kind of a central narrative that connects the whole history of the state. And so what Jim and I are doing is trying to write that narrative. And so it actually covers the entirety of Kansas history. It begins before human contact. So the first chapter starts out with, Kansas being covered by an ocean. Oh. And we were going to move forward until probably around 2018 or 2016, roughly. And so our goal is to talk about Kansas and its importance in not just our local context, but also our national context. And how have Kansans played a role in shaping national policy? How have we played a role in shaping how American culture looks? Of course, Bleeding Kansas, populism, the progressive era, all sorts of topics will be covered. So it is under contract with University Press of Kansas. I think our goal is to hopefully have it appear in 2023, but don't quote me on that because COVID has delayed our research efforts to some degree. Yeah. And it's, made many people's lives a little bit more complicated. So, but we're very excited about it because, especially for people who teach Kansas history, it's really helpful to have a book that connects all of these threads together. And there are so many other excellent books that you can assign on specific topics, but there really is a need for a really cohesive narrative that connects all of these themes. So that's what we're doing. And I'm very excited about it. And hopefully readers will be excited too when it eventually comes out.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited for it too. That sounds excellent. And yeah, it does sound like it's going to fill that hole in Kansas studies and American history as well. So I look forward to reading American Crossroads when it comes out.
And the title is
in 2023.
The title is subject to change. That's the working title, just in case anyone tries to find it later. That's the working title.
Well, thanks again, Kristen. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us this evening. We encourage you to pick up Kristen's book, Slavery on the Periphery, the Kansas-Missouri Border in the Antebellum and Civil War Eras. And so, again, I'll just say thank you, Kristen, for lending us your time and your expertise tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.